please ask your question if you don't mind.
Please.
You got a few questions until we got to go through.
Yes, sir.
You spent 8 years in the Florida House. What would you give me a high point and a low point? What would you say is your greatest accomplishment? What would you say is your worst failure out of 8 years?
I don't even know if it was a legislative accomplishment, and I can tell you, I sponsored some legislation that I thought was very cutting edge. First and foremost, we passed legislation to become the first state in the country to divest our state's pension funds from companies that do business in Iran. I think that's important to send the message that we are not going to prop up the types of global leaders that are supporting terrorism, not just in the Middle East, but also around the globe.
Yeah.
I was a sponsor of legislation to push back against union attempts for card check and certainly fought to save the secret ballot in Florida. I would tell you that the most rewarding experience during my 8 years in the legislature was being able to make a difference in the lives of the people that I represented, and whether it was making a phone call to cut through the red tape or the bureaucracy that allowed the people to either apply for whether it was some type of program or help them to break through the bureaucracy that just slows down government, a permit here or something like that. I think those are the things that really I think your job is in terms of helping people be their link and their voice in Tallahassee. My biggest disappointment was the 4 years that I served in the state legislature when Charlie Crist was governor. And I say it because of this, is because from the very beginning of his term, he was pushing the party to the left and pursuing policies that were not only taking the Republican Party in the wrong direction, but were taking the state of Florida in the wrong direction. And if you remember, his approval ratings at the time were 70+%. And so everything we were doing to fight against that movement was very unpopular at the time. And so it was very frustrating because everyone was trying to tell us, this is the wave of the future for Republicans. This is what Republicans are going to need to do. Fortunately, there has been, I would say, a groundswell shift going back in the direction of limited government conservatism. And I think that has really inspired me. And why I think it's so important is that it's now brought us to a point where we recognize that we are, that there are ideological differences between the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. And I think what we need to do better is be more articulate about what we believe and more importantly about what our vision is for the future of this country.
Okay,
I have a question. Why do you think that so many candidates that are Republican or say they're conservative that get elected and go to Washington, then they end up kind of going soft on the stances and they're not willing to stick to their guns? Why does that happen, and are you going to be different?
I am going to be different, and first and foremost I would tell you that I have signed a pledge to only serve 2 terms in the United States Senate. But even more importantly, I'm going to Washington as your next United States Senator, acting as if I'm only going to serve 1 term. And it's because of this. I believe that the window of opportunity to address the major challenges that we face is narrowing every single day. I believe that as our debt rises as it relates to the size of our government, we are now approaching the levels of debt that will crush economic opportunity and economic growth in this country. We're now at 65% of debt to GDP. When you start to get to the levels of 90 and 100%, economic growth begins to taper off significantly. That's what you're seeing now in places like Greece and elsewhere. And America, the one thing that I remind people is that in spite of our greatness, America is not too big to fail. That's why this fight is so critically important. And so I can't answer the question other than the fact that too many people have been there for too long. They're growing old in the United States Senate. They have lost touch with the people that they represent, and they are more concerned about some type of process-oriented deal
Bill Nelson.
than they are with the actual policies. But it's not just Bill Nelson. We see it on our own Republican side where we have senators who have been there for 24 or 30 or 36 years.
What about term
that's
limits?
just
Is that a possibility?
I am going. One of the first bills that I sponsor in the United States Senate is going to be a constitutional amendment for congressional term limits. And as I told you, I am only going to serve 12 years in the United States Senate if you give me the privilege and honor to be your next United States Senator. But I believe that the first term is going to be critical, because if we kick the can, as we're talking about doing right now, to after the 2012 election, the opportunity from that point in time to promote the policies and implement the policies for economic growth, for stronger national security, we're going to be running out of time very soon. And so I think this is that line in the sand moment right now. Yes, ma'am.
Government is too big. What would you cut first?
I think first and foremost is that you have to understand, and I think you do, that all of our federal budget in Washington, over 60% is non-discretionary. It's entitlement spending. Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and interest on the debt. And so while I certainly have a plan to begin to cut domestic discretionary spending, I would start with Department of Education to see a devolution of power back to the states. Department of Energy, HUD, transportation, so that you can block grant funding back to the states. Those are the things that we need to do. Government has gotten far too big, but the reality is that unless we address the 60% of our budget, we're never going to be able to get to where we need to go. Now, there are some Republicans who are out there saying that we can kick the can for 25 years before we need to reform Medicare. Just not being honest with you. Medicare is going bankrupt, and it's going to happen within the next 10 years. That's why I support the Paul Ryan plan, not because it's the best plan, but it's the only serious plan out there right now that addresses the fact that Medicare is going to be insolvent by 2024, and we need a new system for people 55 years and younger. And so if we don't address the entitlements, we're never going to be able to balance our federal budget, which I believe is something critically important for us to be able to do, because we know Democrats and Republicans in Washington won't do it unless they're forced to do it. And so we have to be able to reform Social Security, raising the retirement age, changing the way benefits are calculated, giving people more freedom to be able to own their own retirement accounts. That is the bigger part of the problem, is that our entitlement spending is unsustainable. And so while we can change the way that we fund foreign aid, critically important, what we fund to the United Nations as well, those alone, those spending reductions and cuts and eliminations alone will not get us to where we need to be. The entitlement system has grown out of control, it's unsustainable, and if we don't do something about it, it is going to collapse on the current beneficiaries, and it is going to result in benefit cuts for them, and it's going to result in crushing taxes and a lower standard and quality of living for future generations. That's what we're fighting for. That's why it's not just about domestic spending or military spending. We have got to tackle head-on entitlement spending.
Have you seen the Rand Paul budget?
I have, and I support a great deal of it. What it concerns me most is that there's no specific plan for Medicare. It just says we're going to put it over to a group of people that's going to come up with a patient-centered system. The Paul Ryan plan actually creates the patient-centered system. The one that says we're going to change the disconnect that exists right now between patients going to see their doctors billing the government, and the government paying for it without the patient understanding what the costs are. That fee-for-service system is leading to high healthcare inflation, and with 10,000 baby boomers a day joining Medicare, those two factors together are what are putting Medicare on the path to insolvency. And so there's a lot in the Rand Paul plan that I support, but the reality is that I believe that we need to have specifics, and that's why I believe that the Paul Ryan plan provides that on Medicare, where the Rand Paul plan doesn't.
But the Republican Study Committee?
I was a supporter of the Republican Study Committee plan as well, and I think that that's something that I guess in 2013 will come back again, because we're probably going to be even deeper in debt and have even larger deficits by that point in time. So I think that's important.
I came from a country which was government own everything, control everything. I hope this it's not going to go the same thing now, because once the government put the nose on everything else, this is no more democracy. That's one thing I would say. Second is, I saw Obama. I don't know if this was my imagination, but I'm asking you as a future senator. They said we have 14.5 trillion in debt. 1 trillion is like 63 miles long if you put $1,000 bills. But that's besides the point. He said in the next decade, that decade supposed to be 10 years, he will save to us 2 trillion. Right. If you divide 14.5 trillion by 2, that meaning times 7, it takes almost 80 years to break even. Is that the reality? Actually